In this video, I am going to talk about two specific experiments on the self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, if you've seen my previous video, or perhaps you need a refresher or reminder, the self-fulfilling prophecy is this phenomenon where you have certain expectations of an individual and you treat them differently based on your expectations. And since you are treating them differently, they start to behave differently, and then they end up acting in accordance with your expectations. You get them to act the way you expect them to act with a self-fulfilling prophecy. All right, so we have two specific experiments on this. Both of them involve the researcher Rosenthal. The first one that I'm going to talk about is with rats, and this was conducted by Rosenthal and Fode, or it might be Fode. I hope I'm not, butchering the name. And in this particular study, you had two groups of rats. And the participants are actually humans who are supposed to be training the rats to run a maze. But the human participants are led to believe that they are there to observe the rats. And so they were told that one group were maze bright rats and the other ones were maze dull rats. And there actually had been previous research back in the 40s where they specifically showed that they could breed rats to be either maze bright or maze dull. All right, so this is not, not this wild idea that the participants might pick up on as like, oh, that's not a real thing. All right, so they were said, okay, now here, go ahead and train your rats to run this maze. The rats were actually randomly assigned. They were not bred to be maze bright or maze dull. They were all just normal rats, randomly assigned to the participants. What was different was the label, which was meant to affect their expectations of the rats. All right. What do you think happened? What do you think the result was? Do you think since all the rats were equal, none of the rats were any different, they should have had equal performance, right? They did not. The rats who had been labeled as maze bright, they performed better than the rats who had been labeled as maze dull. Why might this happen? Well, the human participants expected different things of the rats. They put more effort into it. When they thought they had a maze bright rat, they're like, we're going to get them to do this. If they thought they had a maze dull rat, they would think, well, they're not going to do that well. I'm not going to try too hard. I'm not going to push too hard. And so the rats, their maze running fulfilled the student experimenter's expectations. That's that self-fulfilling prophecy. The rats ended up making their expectations be true because they had been treated differently. All right, can this happen with humans? Absolutely. We do have evidence for this happening with humans. And one very well-known study also with Rosenthal, and this is Rosenthal and Jacobson, 1968. They actually did an experiment with school children and teachers. And so students were given a test, and the teachers were led to believe that it was a test to show their aptitude. All right. It was actually just a bogus test. It was a junk test. It was a garbage test. It was not scored. And the teachers were led to believe that 20% of the students were intellectual bloomers. They were getting ready for a big surge in their learning, essentially. And so the teachers were given this information. And so the children were randomly selected. All right, they were randomly selected to be labeled as bloomers. There was nothing special about any child that was labeled as a bloomer. They were just average, regular kids. All right, and teachers then had expectations of their students. So can you anticipate the result? All right, the students who had been labeled as bloomers, guess what? Their performance during that term, during that observation, their performance matched that of a bloomer. They did have this surge. They did have this impressive academic performance. Now, what happened? Why do we think that this has happened? Teachers expected them to perform well. They expected them to bloom. And so this was first and second grade students. And we believe there was a halo effect. If you need a reminder of the halo effect, and we did cover it in a previous video, that is where you focus on a central trait. to determine your expectations or your impression of an individual. All right, so in this case, the halo effect, they centralized around whether they were labeled as a bloomer or not. They put them in the category bloomer, not bloomer. They treated the bloomers differently. They encouraged them differently. All right, so the bloomers were perceived as more likely to succeed, more interesting, and more curious, even though they were just average kids. The teachers did not realize that they were bringing about this behavior, either through just seeing what they wanted to see or because they were treating the students differently. All right, so let's talk about the study, the intellectual bloomer study. Some negative consequences of that study. One thing that happened is it led to this long tradition. It helped contribute to the long tradition of blaming teachers for everything that goes wrong in education. That's not what it was meant to show, or what even it did show. All right, so teachers were blamed for a lot of problems with education. We do now have plenty of research showing that self-fulfilling prophecies, even though educational self-fulfilling prophecies are absolutely real, we have observed educational self-fulfilling prophecies at work. They are just one influence on student achievement. So you can't blame teachers for everything, and they're working hard. They're trying. All right. And the effect of a self-fulfilling prophecy, an educational self-fulfilling prophecy effect, does decline over time. And so, you know, we definitely have some issues with how people use the results from this study. Now, let's go into a bit more detail about how students might be treated differently if there's an educational self-fulfilling prophecy at work. So one thing that can happen is non-verbal cues. Teachers, often without realizing it, can create a warmer or colder social emotional climate. You know, just simple things like smiling and body language. You know, these simple cues that are like, hey, I enjoy being around you. I like you. I want you to succeed. We give these little messages with our body language, whether we realize it or not. When we've been given pre-information, or when we're using a halo effect of some sort, sometimes we can give these little subtle cues that give messages to students about, hey, do they even like me here? Now, another thing that we do see is teaching more material or more challenging material will differ based on what you expect of the students. If you're thinking that you are dealing with a very bright group of students, or students who've been labeled as intellectual bloomers, you're going to push them. You are going to give them the challenging material. You are going to give them the complicated material. You are going to assume that they're going to like it, that they're going to like the challenge, that they can handle it. So we do see that's one area. You give them the more difficult material. You also provide more opportunities to respond. I don't know if you've ever seen this in a classroom situation when there's verbal, answering questions in class. I know some students hate that. But, let's say teachers going around calling on students, and they say, okay, so what is the answer to number 6? And you don't know, and so you just say, oh, I don't know. If they think that you have the potential to get it, they are going to push you to try. They're going to give you a longer pause, a longer opportunity for you to respond. Whereas if they don't think that you have the ability, they might think, well, okay, I gave them a chance. And then you're like, I don't know. They're, okay, fine, I'm moving on. Or they don't give you they give you the slightest pause to give an answer, and you're working on an answer. You haven't come up with it yet. And they're like, okay, out of time, let's call on somebody else. We do see that teachers will do this differently for different students. So the amount of time for responding and the opportunities, the pushing them, letting them try again, letting them answer again, letting them redo a quiz. You're more likely to do that when you feel like someone has the ability to improve. And then students get more individualized feedback. All right, so giving them the information for, this is what you got wrong, this is why you got it wrong, this is how you can improve this project, this is how you can improve this paper. This sort of information you're more likely to give to somebody who you feel like will benefit from that feedback. I've seen this in my own classes. I have some students who very vocally tell me, I never read feedback. You know, and if I spend an hour writing feedback all over a paper for like a research paper, and the student has told me they don't read the feedback, I'll be like, I don't want to write anything. They're not going to read it. All right. But sometimes the motivation for giving detailed feedback, instead of being based on a student telling you they're not going to read it anyway, it could be based on, well, they're not going to benefit from the feedback. I'm not going to write that much because it's not going to help them. If you think it's going to help them, you're going to go ahead and give that lengthy, more elaborate feedback. All right. Self-fulfilling prophecies have been observed in a variety of settings. Parents can introduce self-fulfilling prophecies to their children. Workplace self-fulfilling prophecies happen. There are all sorts of situations where you could have self-fulfilling prophecies. It's this cycle where you expect people to act a certain way or perform a certain way. You treat them differently, whether you realize it or not, and then they start to act differently. And then you get to say, well, I was right. They are not as good. You know, they are not that talented. They are, they don't have that potential. I knew it. I was right. All right, so if you go into an area where you are somebody's boss, somebody's teacher, somebody's parent, judge, jury, law enforcement, any situation where you can introduce a self-fulfilling prophecy, think about it. Keep your self-fulfilling prophecy behavior in check. Keep your tendency to form halo effects and faulty impressions in check, because we have this tendency to do it and it can cause harm.